You're standing in a river valley in Ice Age Europe, around 40,000 years ago. The reindeer herds that fed your group all winter never arrived this season. The berries are gone. The roots are frozen 2 feet under solid ground. Every plant you can name nearby has already been eaten, by you or by someone else. You haven't had a full meal in 6 days. And your body isn't sending a polite reminder anymore. It's sending a constant grinding scream that gets louder by the hour. There is no store, no neighbor with extra. Somewhere in that valley, though, is the actual answer to how your species didn't simply lie down and disappear. You, right now, have never once genuinely wondered where your next meal is coming from. Somewhere within a short drive of almost anywhere you've lived, there's a building stacked floor to ceiling with food, restocked before you even notice it's low. Ancient humans didn't have that building, or that safety net. They had to know almost everything edible around them, or they didn't survive the season. So when the herds vanished, when the plants died back, when the entire food system a group depended on simply failed, how did ancient humans actually survive total food collapse over and over for hundreds of thousands of years? In 2004, archaeobotanists Dolores Piperno and Ehud Weiss published findings in the journal Nature based on a site called Ohala II on the shore of the Sea of Galilee in Israel. The camp is roughly 23,000 years old, nearly 12,000 years before anyone on Earth planted a deliberate crop. Buried in the floor of a small brush hut, researchers found a flat stone worn smooth in one spot, coated in thousands of microscopic starch grains from wild wheat, barley, and oats. Later analysis of flint blades from the same hut showed wear patterns matching repeated cereal harvesting, not casual, one-off foraging. This wasn't a lucky one-time meal. It was routine, deliberate work. Someone at Ohala II was cutting wild grass seed heads by hand, carrying them back to camp, and grinding them down into something close to flour. A slow, labor-intensive process for a food most people today would walk straight past without a second glance. Not for a special occasion. For survival, on repeat, thousands of years before agriculture existed even as an idea. Everyone assumes bread needed farms first. It didn't. It needed hunger, a flat rock, and enormous patience. So what happened when even grinding grass wasn't enough? Here's where the story gets stranger. In 2011, anthropologist Amanda Henry and her colleagues published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, built from something almost nobody thinks to examine closely: dental plaque. They studied hardened calculus scraped from the teeth of Neanderthal skeletons at Shanidar Cave in Iraq, dated to roughly 46,000 years old, and Spy Cave in Belgium, dated to around 36,000 years old. Trapped inside that ancient plaque, preserved for tens of thousands of years, were microscopic starch grains from date palms, legumes, and wild grass seeds. Many of those grains showed a very specific kind of damage, the kind that only happens from sustained exposure to heat and water. In other words, from cooking. For decades, the working theory was simple. Neanderthals were apex carnivores, built almost entirely around meat and megafauna, with little use for plants. This evidence says otherwise. When the big, reliable game thinned out or simply wasn't available that season, Neanderthals were already boiling and roasting plant foods that most people alive today couldn't name or identify. Everyone assumes Neanderthals disappeared, partly because they couldn't adapt their diet the way modern humans could. The plaque in their own teeth disagrees. But that same flexibility had a much darker edge, and one Neanderthal site shows exactly where that edge sits. In 2006, paleoanthropologist Antonio Rosas of Spain's National Museum of Natural Sciences in Madrid published findings from El Sidrón Cave in the Asturias region of northern Spain. His team recovered more than 2,000 bone fragments belonging to at least 13 Neanderthals, dated to roughly 49,000 years old. 3 men, several women, and multiple children among them. The long bones and skulls in that group had been deliberately broken open. Marrow, one of the most calorie-dense substances the human body can access, had been extracted the exact same way it would be pulled from a hunted animal carcass. Rosas was careful about the conclusion he drew. The cut marks matched patterns typically seen on butchered game, not on any known burial ritual. Later isotope analysis of the same bones showed signs consistent with prolonged nutritional stress in the months before death. The most widely supported reading isn't cruelty, and it isn't ritual. It's starvation, a group so far past the edge of their food supply that the very last available calories were each other. So does that mean ancient humans were always one bad season away from an act like that? The next piece of evidence says not exactly. In 1968, anthropologist Richard Lee published a landmark study of the Ju-Hwanzi San people of the Dobi area in Botswana, one of the last populations on Earth still living almost entirely by hunting and foraging. Lee cataloged their diet in exhaustive detail and found something remarkable. At least 105 separate edible plant species in regular, ongoing use, more than most people today could name in an entire lifetime, on top of dozens of hunted animals. The mongongo nut alone made up roughly half of their vegetable diet by weight, and, gram for gram, carried nearly 5 times the calories and 10 times the protein of an equivalent serving of corn. When one food source failed, a drought year, a bad fruiting season for one particular plant, 100 quiet others were already waiting behind it, ready to be picked up without panic. When Lee asked why the group had never taken up farming the land around them, one man gave him a simple, almost offhand answer: why should we, when there are so many mongongo nuts in the world? Everyone assumes hunter-gatherers lived closer to starvation than modern people do, one bad hunt away from disaster. The evidence points closer to the opposite. A group depending on 100 different food sources was often far harder to starve out than a modern system depending on a handful of crops, grown thousands of miles from the people who actually eat them. So what's the real answer underneath all 4 of these stories? It was never one clever trick. It was never a single miracle food, and it wasn't raw physical toughness either. Every piece of evidence points to the same underlying strategy: relentless, almost obsessive dietary flexibility. Grinding grass into flour thousands of years before farming existed as an idea. Cooking tubers and roots that most people alive today couldn't identify by sight. Knowing 100 backup foods before the first one ever failed. And, in the very worst season imaginable, being willing to do the unthinkable rather than simply lie down and stop. The real survival tool was never a specific food at all. It was the refusal to ever depend on just one. Go back to that valley, 40,000 years ago, 6 days into real hunger. That person didn't survive because one perfect food appeared out of nowhere to save them. They survived because somewhere in their mind was a running list. Grasses, tubers, marrow, 100 quiet backups nobody thought twice about until the exact day everything else was already gone. You inherited that same mind, built by all of it. You just spend it scrolling a menu instead of scanning a hillside. We didn't outgrow the hunger that shaped us. We built a supply chain long enough and quiet enough to make that hunger invisible. And somewhere along the way, we mistook the silence for safety.